So we're very pleased tonight to present to you Sally Matson and her alter ego, Susan B. Anthony. Sally has been acting and directing for 30 years, and she has been touring the country for the last 9 years presenting Susan B. Anthony. So prepare yourselves to be taken back at a more difficult time in history, and meet one of the most courageous women in our history, as well as a real advocate for human rights. So please join me in welcoming Susan B. Anthony.
Thank you. Well, what a joy it is to be back in New Hampshire, where they are throwing roses at me now instead of eggs. Still, I always look to see if there are newspaper men in the audience. I am used to their barbs. I am used to being lampooned, although now, in 1902, most of the newspaper men have grown quite fond of me. Now they call me Saint Susan. I am famous. I receive telegrams. I will just put this one over here, because what I would like to do is take you back in time and explain to you how I became the famous Susan B. Anthony. Well, I was born in 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts, where my father built a cotton mill, the first of its kind in the area. We even had mill girls boarding at our house. Then when I was 6, we moved to Battenville, New York, north of Albany, where he operated a much larger mill. And one day he came to the 6 of us, I had 3 sisters and 2 brothers, and said, "Who would like to go into the mill to replace a spooler who is sick?" Well, Hannah and I clamored for the job. We drew straws, and I won. So after 2 weeks, I came home with $3, which I shared with Hannah, as agreed beforehand. It was very exciting, earning my own money. But being in the mill all day made me realize how lucky I am to be educated. We are Quakers, and my parents have always been adamant about making sure not just the boys in the family are educated, but also all of us girls. They had teachers come to the house, and then when I was 16, they sent me to a private seminary in Philadelphia. Well, that only lasted 1 year, because in the bank panic of 1837, my father's mill failed, and I had to come home to become a teacher in my teens. They did not just close his mill. They took our house, they took our furniture, they even took my mother's most personal possessions, because a married woman's property belongs to her husband. Well, that made an impression on me. Married women have no legal rights. Eventually, we moved to Rochester, New York, where I became involved in the Unitarian Church, and where I've been teaching for years, earning $2.50 a week, as opposed to the $10 earned by men in the exact same position. We have a farm here, so like many teachers, I work on the farm in the summer and teach in the winter. You know, our homes have always been centers of activism. My father is an abolitionist, but Rochester, New York was a beehive of abolition. We had people like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison coming to our house to talk about abolition and women's rights. That made a huge impression on me and on my brothers and sisters. Merritt and Daniel, my brothers, became involved in John Brown's struggle to free the slaves in Kansas. I was involved as an agent for the New York State Anti-Slavery Society, and my parents supported me every step of the way as I became more and more of an activist. Oh, I remember one time I was helping a woman escape from her abusive husband. It was Senator Phelps from Massachusetts, actually. And she took her child, which was illegal because only men have custody of their children. Well, I took them by train to New York. I know that was only a temporary solution, but my father said to me, wrote to me at the time, What you're doing is legally wrong, but morally right. Well then, in 1851, I finally met the famous Mrs. Stanton, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She is the one who organized the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. And her Declaration of Sentiments exactly copied the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. She has a brilliant mind, and she is a good speaker. But we could not be more unlike each other. She is wealthy with a husband and children. I am single, a school teacher, and somewhat shy. Still, we figured out that we work very well together, and we both have one obsession: equal rights for women. So after 15 years of teaching, I gave that up and became a full-time activist. Currently, I am president of the Rochester chapter of the Daughters of Temperance Society. Well, you know, public drunkenness is an enormous problem. If a woman wants to leave her drunken husband, she will lose not only all of her money, she will lose her children possibly. So last week I went to the New York State Convention. And do you know, only men were allowed to speak. And they were making fun of the women who were wearing bloomers. Now, I have some on right now, you see? Amelia Bloomer came up with the name for these. We would have pants and then our skirts up to here, so we weren't tripping and dragging them through the mud. Oh, it was a wonderful feeling of freedom. You can't imagine. But you know what happened. Everybody was laughing at us in the streets. They were making cartoons in the newspapers. Nobody was listening to a thing we had to say, so we all went back to wearing our clumsy skirts. And anyway, the temperance women think that I am spending too much time on women's rights. Well, that is true. I do not think the prohibition of alcohol is going to solve our problems. I think that women need the right to be educated, they need the right to control their own money, and they need the right to vote. All this past winter of 1853-54, I've gone door to door in Rochester getting signatures on property and wage reform. I've sent 60 women to 60 counties. I think people were amazed to see unchaperoned women going from town to town, knocking on every door. Oh, if you could excuse me a moment, I have a sore foot. It is frostbite, actually. They had to lift me onto the stage to speak one time. I'm in charge of all the details now. I get the meeting hall and the program and the ushers and the lights. And Mrs. Stanton and I are a team, but now that she has 5 children, she stays home to write the speeches, and I am the one that goes on the road. Well, you know, she is the philosopher. I'm the one that gets the facts and statistics. I am the organizer. But I will tell you, it still takes all my courage to speak in front of a crowd. So we have 6,000 signatures on property and wage reform. If you will stay after and sign the petition, you see, when I'm able to get thousands of signatures, then possibly we can have a new law in Albany. Oh, and I made 20,000 copies of Mrs. Stanton's speech. There is a new platen jobber printer now, prints them right out. And I put one on the desk of every Senate and Assembly member, so that ought to do it. Oh, well, no. The bill on property and wage reform failed. Well, that's all right. We'll go a different route. Only this time, Mrs. Stanton is having her 7th baby. Dear Mrs. Stanton, those of you who have the talent to do honor to poor womanhood have all given yourselves over to having babies and left poor brainless me to do battle alone. It is a shame such a body as I might be spared to rock cradles, but it is a crime for you. Signed, Susan B. Anthony. Well, I've been going back and forth to the state capitol in Albany. The last time I went, with my petitions, most of the men laughed at me. They said, women already have the best seats in the House, the best seats on the carriages and on the cars. We give them the choicest cut of meat. What else do they want? When one man said, what right do you have to speak on married woman's property rights when you are not married? I said, what right do you have to speak on abolition when you are not a slave? Diary. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin is causing a stir. Thousands now realize the horrors of slavery, and I have lost my fear of public speaking. It was the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott is a slave who came north to Illinois, a free state. He has been trying to sue for his freedom for the past 10 years. The Supreme Court just decided no. He may not sue. He was not a citizen when the Constitution was written. He was property. Well, some people began to take our women's rights message seriously. We had $5,000 from Francis Jackson in Boston. 1861. Today superintended the plowing of the orchard. The last load of hay is in the barn. All is in capital order. Fitted out a fugitive slave with the help of Harriet Tubman. Oh, you all know Harriet Tubman. She escaped in Maryland and went back 13 times. In all, she thinks she saved 80 people through the Underground Railroad, and as she said, I never lost a passenger. Well, if slaves came up the rivers, they might come up the Hudson River, cross along the Erie Canal to Rochester, and we would send them across Lake Ontario to Canada. We would fit them out with food and money and maps, and sometimes they would hide in the produce in the wagons on the way to Canada. Well, last week, I spent the entire week helping with Mrs. Stanton's family because a friendly legislator said, if Mrs. Stanton would speak for the bill one more time, the married woman's property bill, maybe it will pass. So I took care of the children and she gave the talk. And don't you know, it passed. Now women can have sole responsibility for their own property, they can sue in court, and they can have joint custody of their children. 7 years. 7 years it's taken to get to this first step toward women's rights. But oh, the babysitting. Dear Mrs. Stanton, oh, this babydom. What a constant, never-ending, all-consuming strain. We should never ask anything else of the woman who has to endure it. Oh, well, truthfully, I spent many a day and evening at Mrs. Stanton's dining room table crafting our speeches with her children running around. I didn't care. In fact, Mrs. Stanton wrote to me recently and said, our speeches may be considered the united product of our two brains. I forge the thunderbolts and you fire them. That is true. I am speaking almost every night of the week. But I called 1861 the winter of the mobs. Entire mobs are coming out to greet me now. They do not like women speaking in public. And they do not like what I have to say, not about abolition and not about women's rights. They're jeering and stamping their feet. At one session, they doused the lanterns and left me standing in the dark. But Syracuse was the worst. I was burned in effigy and dragged through the streets. Oh, I should read to you what some of the newspaper men have to say about me. My father suggested that I keep all of this in a scrapbook, and that is exactly what I'm doing. We received an unfavorable opinion of this Miss Anthony when she performed in our city on a former occasion. But we confess that after listening to her discourse last evening, we were inexpressively disgusted with the impudence and impiety evinced in her lecture. Personally repulsive, she seems to be laboring under feelings of strong hatred toward men, the effect, we presume, of jealousy and neglect. That was the Utica Evening Telegraph. Susan is lean, cadaverous, and intellectual, with the proportions of a file and the voice of a hurdy-gurdy. New York World. In appearance, Miss Anthony typifies the old maid, tall, angular, and inclined to be vinegar-visaged. Miss Anthony's style of speaking is rather stiff and cold. That was the Michigan Times and Explorer. And then one man criticized my entire talk and then said, "This shrewish maiden concluded her remarks with a flourish of trumpets that the women's rights question could not be put down, after which she gathered her short skirts around her tight pants, sat down and wiped her spectacles." Well, I told you, I wore bloomers for a whole year, but this is my favorite. From the Oregon City Enterprise. We could not help thinking, what a fine-looking and useful woman she might have been had she got married years ago. We wish she had been more fortunate in her younger days. Well, balderdash. That's nonsense, all of it. Meanwhile, Mrs. Stanton and I had formed the Woman's National Loyal League, so that all during the Civil War, we put women's rights aside and concentrated on the abolition of slavery. But I should give you an aside right now. While we were occupied with the Civil War, a small group of lawyers went up to Albany and with one stroke of the pen obliterated the married woman's property law. Well, Abraham Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation, but that only freed the slaves in the rebellious states. What about all the slaves who had come north? We knew it would take a federal amendment, and we began working just as we had for women. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman doctor, was recruiting nurses with Clara Barton. Women were in hospitals and schools and factories. But at the end of the Civil War, we had a problem. The 13th Amendment freed the slaves. That was wonderful. The 14th Amendment gave them citizenship. But in the second paragraph of that amendment, it mentions the word male. The first and only time in our Constitution the word male is used. And then we could see where they were going. They were going to give black men the vote with the 15th Amendment, not black women, not white women. We would have to get back on our trail and begin working for women's suffrage again. And when we did, we lost the support of many of our abolitionist allies. Wendell Phillips, who had loaned me money, William Lloyd Garrison, whose newspaper in Boston, The Liberator, always championed our cause, Frederick Douglass in Rochester, they all said, no, the black man needs to go first. Even Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, one of our strongest advocates, said, "This is a critical period for the Republican Party and for the nation. I conjure you to remember that this is the Negro's hour. If you persevere, you need depend on no further help from me or the Tribune." Well, that was a blow. And then our own colleague in Boston, Lucy Stone, said that she was in favor of the 15th Amendment. So at this point, we formed in New York the National Woman's Suffrage Association. We would go after the vote with a federal amendment. Lucy Stone, Julia Ward Howe, and others in Boston formed the American Women's Suffrage Association. They would go after the vote state by state. So those two groups operated separately for 20 years. Well, in 1871, Mrs. Stanton and I headed all the way across the country to California, hoping to influence legislators along the way. We were both in our 50s, but holding up quite well despite bed bugs in our clothing, poor drinking water. Sometimes, I have to tell you, we would travel 40 or 50 miles in an open wagon over the corduroy roads. Do you know those? The mud roads with logs laid across. Sometimes I would sit up next to the driver in the stagecoach and ask him what he thought about women's suffrage. Well, traveling through Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, I would give the evening speech on suffrage, and Mrs. Stanton would give the afternoon speeches on the more delicate subjects: marriage and maternity, divorce, drunkenness, trade unions, the ordination of women. Oh, she had 100 ideas. Once we were crossing the Mississippi, and the boat became icebound. People were tired and hungry, and one man said, "Speech on women's rights." So right there in the middle of the river, we gave our talk. And don't you know, we had a few converts on the mother of all waters, the Mississippi. The only time I was taken by surprise is when I was asked to speak at an insane asylum. I said, I have enough trouble talking to the sane. What am I going to say to an audience of lunatics? But my hostess from St. Louis said, no, don't you see? This is your golden moment. This is your opportunity, according to the Constitution, to address an audience of your peers. For isn't it true that suffrage is denied to idiots, lunatics, criminals, and women? Well, when I came back to the East Coast, the New York Press Club invited me to a dinner at Delmonico's. There were only a few women included, and each of us was given an impromptu question. Mine was, why don't the men propose marriage? Precisely the question, gentlemen, that has puzzled my brain for the past quarter of a century. It is my personal opinion, however, that it is not that the men do not propose, but that the right ones do not. But we strong-minded women are working hard to relieve you of this embarrassing question. So as soon as you give women an equal chance at money getting, we will make our own fortunes, build our own brownstones, and invite the grandest of you to share them with us. Well, 1870, the black man had the vote, but I decided that I would like to vote too. So in the presidential election of 1872, along with my sisters Hannah, Mary, Guelma, and 12 other women, we marched down to the barber shop where they were registering, and I read the 14th Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States. Well, I said to the man, I don't think you can deny that women are both persons and citizens. We did not think they would allow us to register, and then we would sue. But they did not know what to do with us. So we all registered, and then went back to vote on the appropriate day. Dear Mrs. Stanton, well, I have been and gone and done it. Nothing happened for 2 weeks. And then on Thanksgiving Day, a U.S. Marshal came to the house to arrest me. He was quite embarrassed and said that I could go into town on my own. And I said, oh no, you will escort me. And when we got to the streetcar and the man asked for my fare, I said, this gentleman is taking me to jail. He will pay my fare. When I got to the jail, everybody was allowed to leave except me, which I thought was good, because maybe I could go on to the Supreme Court. But my lawyer, not wanting to see me in jail, paid the $1,000 bail, so I was free. Well, for 6 months. I spoke in every district in Monroe County. Friends and fellow citizens, I stand before you under indictment for the alleged crime of having voted in the past presidential election. It should be my work this evening to prove to you not only did I not commit a crime, but instead exercised my citizen's right, guaranteed to you and to all by the United States Constitution. The preamble to our Constitution says, "We the people." It was we the people, not we the white male citizens. However much the doctors of law may disagree as to whether people and citizens are one and the same, or whether the 14th Amendment allows suffrage, the 15th Amendment should settle the question. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, unfortunately, this speech went on for 2 hours, but apparently it influenced too many prospective jurors. They moved my trial to Canandaigua. On the day of the trial, the district attorney suggested that women are incompetent to testify in court, and the judge agreed. So I wasn't able to speak in my own defense. Then the next day, the judge came in with a pre-written statement, ordered the jury to find me guilty, and dismissed them. It was a travesty. When he said, "Does the prisoner have anything to say why sentence should not be pronounced?" I said, "Yes, Your Honor, I have many things to say, for in your ordered verdict of guilty, you have trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government. My natural rights, my civil rights, my judicial rights are all ignored. Robbed of the fundamental right of citizenship, I am degraded from a citizen to that of a subject. And not only myself individually, but all of my sex are, by Your Honor's verdict, doomed to political subjection under this so-called Republican government. The court cannot listen to a rehearsal of arguments the prisoner's counsel has already consumed 3 hours in presenting." If it please Your Honor, I'm not arguing the question. I'm simply stating the reasons why sentence cannot, in justice, be pronounced against me. Your denial of my citizen's right to vote is a denial of my right of consent as one of the governed, the denial of my right of representation as one of the taxed, the denial of my right to a trial by a jury of my peers. The prisoner will sit down. Well, I interrupted Judge Hunt 4 times. What difference did it make? He had already pronounced me guilty. When he said I had to pay a $100 fine, I told him, "I will never pay $1 of your unjust penalty, and I never will." So do you know? They let that go. They did not want to have to deal with me anymore. So we lost. But I think it was a great turning point for the women's rights movement. We had money pouring in, and we realized we could not challenge the 14th and 15th Amendments. We would have to have our own suffrage amendment. Now, before I went out west and before I was arrested, I had published a newspaper. This was the masthead, "The Revolution, men, their rights, and nothing more. Women, their rights, and nothing less." The point of this newspaper was to advocate for an 8-hour day and equal pay for women. Do you know how many young girls were in the mills in Lowell and Lawrence and Manchester? They needed equal pay and shorter hours. Mrs. Stanton was the main editor, and Parker Pillsbury from New Hampshire. Unfortunately, the main person behind all the money moved to England, and after 2 years, my paper failed, and I was left with a $10,000 debt. It took 6 years to pay off that debt. But when I finally did, people praised me for not using the Bankrupt Act. You see, I'm not sure you understand. Women have been voting in Wyoming since 1869. When we were out there, I befriended the governor in Wyoming, and he wrote recently to say they'd had a baby. I wrote back and said, well, what is it, a boy or a girl? His answer, no matter which, this is Wyoming. Yes, but things were not so rosy in Washington, D.C., where so many legislators were still firmly against women's suffrage. One of my greatest friends was Henry Blair in New Hampshire. He was a great ally. And also Benjamin Butler and George Hoare in Massachusetts, Thomas Palmer in Michigan. But you know, Senator Baird of Delaware said, with women's suffrage, you will no longer have the healthful and necessary subordination of wife to husband. And George Vest of Missouri said, I would not degrade woman by giving her the right of suffrage. It would destroy her influence. It would take her down from the pedestal where she is today. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1876, while this country was celebrating its grand centennial from Britain, we asked if we could present our Women's Declaration of Rights in Philadelphia. The men said, no, I'm sorry, we have our agenda all set. Well, I was able to get 5 press passes from my brother's newspaper in Kansas. And when they read the Declaration of Independence in Independence Hall, the 5 of us marched down that aisle and presented our declaration, and they had to put it into the minutes. Do you see? 1/2 of the citizens of this nation, after a century of boasted liberty, are still political slaves. We are utterly sick and tired of being pushed back and insulted. Sick and tired of it. I am tired of having every little stripling of 21, half drunk, half nothing, look me in the face and feel that he is my superior, and feel that he knows more than the best women that ever lived. Well, by the late 1880s and 1890s, I was again out west with younger colleagues now. There were many more railroad lines, and I was treated to the private railroad cars of Mrs. A.A. Sargent and Mrs. Leland Stanford. I spent 2 years in California hoping to pass this referendum on women's suffrage, traveling up and down the state. We lost. I think we were defeated mostly by the liquor lobbies. And then I was invited to return to Oregon, where I had been in 1871. Do you know what they were doing in Oregon? They were requiring saloon keepers to recruit 25 men each to vote against women's suffrage. That's what we were up against. On the way back east, my train was stuck in the highest peaks of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. It took 200 men to shovel us out of there. For 3 days, all we had to eat was dried fish. But when I came back east, I was helping Mrs. Stanton and Mrs. Gage write the History of Women's Suffrage, volumes 1, 2, 3, and I was trying to get women admitted into the University of Rochester. It just meant giving more speeches. Women, we may as well be great Newfoundland dogs, out baying at the moon as to be petitioning for bills without the power to vote. As long as the constitutors of New York and Ohio say all may vote at 21, except idiots, lunatics, and criminals, we are brought to that level. This discrimination is a relic of the Dark Ages. Well, you know, one young man asked if I ever had any fun. I told him those trips out west, you know, were pretty exciting. And I did go to the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. Do you know about it? It was called the White City, the Columbian Exposition, and they had the largest Ferris wheel that has ever been invented. Well, you know, the lady managers at the fair thought that it should be closed on Sundays. Now, I did not think that was right. Then all the day laborers would miss the fair. But Buffalo Bill Cody was out there with his Wild West show, and he heard what I had to say and invited me to his show. Now, didn't I enjoy that? Oh, you know, the other night I had to send someone back to the rooms to get my red shawl. The newspaper men said, "No red shawl, no report." I did not realize it had become such a symbol. 1900 is the final deadline for admitting women into the University of Rochester. I have helped raise $50,000 in pledges. Not one of the trustees has given anything, though there are several millionaires. I put up the last necessary $2,000 from my own life insurance policy. Well, they let the girls in. They said there was no alternative. Good. 1900, I am 80 years old. In the old days, people thought that I was a witch with horns. Now they think we are all lovely. They had quite a to-do for me at the Lafayette Opera House in Washington, D.C. Letters and telegrams came in. President McKinley invited me to the White House, but do you know, I have been to the White House under 5 presidents, invited myself a few times, and not one of those gentlemen has done anything to further our cause. In 1902, I sent out a questionnaire asking what all the senators thought of women's suffrage, and Massachusetts Henry Cabot Lodge said, "I have always voted against women's suffrage, and I have seen as yet no reason to change my opinion." October 26, 1902, Elizabeth Cady Stanton passed away today. Mrs. Stanton. For 50 years, we have had an unbroken friendship. If I had died first, she would have had beautiful phrases to say about our friendship, but I cannot put it into words. In 1906, National American Woman Suffrage Association Convention, Baltimore. Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. If any proof were needed of the progress of the cause for which I have worked, it is here today, the presence on the stage of these college women, and in the audience of all these college girls who will someday be the nation's greatest strength, tell their own story to the world. They give me the greatest joy and encouragement. There have been others just as true and devoted to the cause. I wish I could name them all. But with such women consecrating their lives, failure is impossible. Well, Susan B. Anthony went home to Rochester and died 1 month later at the age of 86. And despite a raging blizzard, 10,000 people waited in the snow to go into the Presbyterian church, the only place large enough for her funeral. And for those who do not recall, it was another 14 years, 1920, when women finally had the vote. Thank you. I will be very happy to have questions. First, I should like to thank very fondly the New Hampshire Humanities Council who funded this show. They are an independent private organization, not a government organization. They fund all these wonderful programs in New Hampshire that you get to see. So I thank them, and I thank Alan Cohen for finding me somehow and bringing me up here. So very much enjoyed performing tonight. And so I hope there are some questions, or else I have questions for you.
You mentioned that women were not educated. Were they legally kept out of public schools?
Not legally, no. None of these things were legal against women, but girls were definitely not encouraged to be educated. Here is Mrs. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the most brilliant women of her day, but her father just kept saying, "Oh, I wish you were a boy," you know, and she read everything, Greek and Latin and everything she could to be educated. They just weren't sent to school most of the time because what a waste. They're just going to be home doing needlepoint anyway. You know, that was the theory. So why would you need to be educated? So it was a very long time of, yes.
What age did Susan B. Anthony start wanting to change women's rights?
That's a very good question. She wasn't really on board in the very beginning. First of all, she was trying to help support her family by being a teacher. And then she taught for 15 years. She even became a headmistress in Canajoharie. But then Lucy Stone gave a speech in Worcester, and that inspired her. And then she met Mrs. Stanton, and then suddenly around the time she was about 30, actually, she got on board and decided, this is what I want to do. I want to work for women's rights. That was a very good question, actually. So could I ask you, why do you think the women out west had the vote decades before we did in the enlightened East? Why?
I'm thinking that they were contributing to society, especially out in Wyoming, and Wyoming perhaps wanted more women to come there because it was isolated, so that would be attracted to them to go out and be able to vote.
I think you hit it on the head. They needed population in those Wyoming, Idaho, Utah. They needed population for representation because they had so few people represented. So yes, that was a brilliant idea to say the women could vote. And of course, the women were possibly on a more even keel out there. They went out with their husbands. They chose to do that. And they weren't all working on farms. You know, that's a misconception. But they were more of partners, possibly. Yes.
What other states gave women the right to vote?
Yes. Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, and Colorado. Those four had the vote in the 1890s. Think about that. And then came California. Well, I think I have these all written down. California, Oregon, and Washington in 1910, 11, 12. Oh, yeah. And then came Kansas and Arizona, Alaska, Illinois, Montana, Nevada. If there's a map over there on my table where you'll see the whole western side of the, the country has it by, 1917 at least. But there's still the whole eastern side and the whole southern side. The whole southern part of the country didn't even ratify it, even after it passed, until, 1969, 1971. I mean, outrageous. They just didn't ratify it. I mean, it passed. It passed when 33 states were able to sign off on it. And Tennessee was the 31st, I think it was 31. And he was debating, and his mother wrote to him and said, "You will do it." And so they did it. But
That was Andrew Jackson, wasn't it?
no, not Andrew Jackson. No.
Oh, okay.
No. It was a man named Burns, I think, Henry Burns. No. Jeanette Rankin was the first woman elected to the U.S. House. And Montana got the vote in 1914, and she was elected, I think, in 1916. So that was pretty bold. Yes?
Equal Rights Amendment was still in force in 1970 and 75, and I went to a convention where I spoke for New Hampshire. And during that convention, I said equal rights is 18 words, and I said them. The whole congregation from the southern United States got up and walked out.
Well, that gives you an idea of how we didn't get that voted upon. Yeah. The American Equal Rights Association was something that started right after, right after the Civil War, and they were hoping that then the black people and the women would all get the vote together, and yet that didn't work. So that was unfortunate. I don't know if the Equal Rights Amendment will ever pass at this point. Do you? I don't know. I don't think many of the young women don't see the point of it now. You see, so many young women have gone beyond all this, and they already have good jobs, and they're ministers and lawyers and doctors. But there's still plenty of women who aren't on equal footing, so it's too bad. Yes?
The states that allowed women to vote, was that just state elections?
No, that was federal. That was federal elections. So they were way ahead of us. And other countries were way ahead too, yes.
Did Susan B. Anthony go to college?
She went for 1 year. Her parents sent her 1 year down to the, seminary in Philadelphia. But then her father lost all his money, so she had to come back. So she really didn't. She was self-educated, and she did pretty well. She was very, very shy in the beginning and very, very terrified of giving speeches. She had them all memorized, but that's not a good way. It wasn't a good way for her. So then she learned to just speak from the heart, and she did better. But do you know, I would never have her courage. Would you? I mean, she had people throwing things at her, turning out the lights on her. She had people making fun of her. I wouldn't like that if people were making fun of me. She's very strong woman. I think her Quaker upbringing helped with that. Because women who were Quakers were allowed to speak in public and allowed to speak in their churches. They were given much more and allowed to be educated. I have a wonderful story for you about one of your people, Marilla Ricker, a woman in New Hampshire who became a lawyer, and she was practicing in front of the Supreme Court, but she was not allowed to vote. And she said, well, sometimes it takes people several centuries to become acclimated to an idea. And that's for sure. But anyway, I do have one piece of good news for you, and that is that on the new Citizenship Test, you have to know who Susan B. Anthony is. So all of the new people will know. And also, I should congratulate you, not because I'm a Democrat or a Republican, but on all of the women that you have voted into office. That's astounding. You're the state, right, with the whole thing is women, the governor, the senators, that's amazing. That's very impressive. I don't know how you did that.
We were tricked.
You were tricked. That's.
A few men had to vote.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, some men had to vote, that's right. Well, I did have one show I did in Florida. I've only gone there twice, I think. And as soon as I finished, one man raised his hand and said, "Why are we still talking about women equal pay?" And I said, "Oh, well, because there are some issues still." He said, "Well, I had a company and I paid all of them." And I said, "Well, that's good. That is good news." But at that point, there were all these women suing Walmart. Do you remember that? Like 6 million women or something. And they finally got thrown out because it was too many women and they couldn't deal with it. So there are certainly some women who aren't being paid equally or promoted equally. And the other thing I have on the table over there, I hope I put it out, is do you know that there were women against woman suffrage? Do you know that there were entire clubs of women, prominent Portland women against women's suffrage? Now, why would that be? Just let me follow this thought for 1 second. Why would there be women against women's suffrage? Oh, are you answering that?
Because they thought they liked how they were being treated as they were.
Right. Some women thought, well, I already have everything I need, so I'm okay.
Like how the men thought that they already got things.
Right. The men said, we treat you well. You have the choicest cut of meat. You have all your clothes and you're all set. But that wouldn't be all the women, would it? What about all the single women? And what about all the women who were maybe not in such a good marriage? So interesting. I don't know how old you are. What grade are you in? Seventh. I had a child, I think in the 5th grade, say they were scared. And I thought that was a very astute thing to say, because some of those women probably were scared. Why? Because you heard what I said. The men had all the power. They had the money, they owned your money, they had the children. This joint custody thing went back and forth, and women's property rights went back and forth for many years. So maybe some women were scared and just decided, well, I'm not going to, I don't think my husband likes this and I'm not going to speak up. So that's what happened for some people.
What led you into the portrayal?
Well,
As you do so very, very well.
thank you. I've been acting most of my life. I studied acting and then I became a teacher. And I've been moving around with my husband from state to state and always trying to start over. I think many women do that. You have to keep reinventing yourself, So when our last stop, I think, is in Andover, Massachusetts, and I learned all about, I went to work for the American Textile History Museum in Lowell that you should go to, and learned all about the mill girls and 19th century history. And then when I started getting tired of that job, I decided I'm going to do what I've always wanted to do, a one-woman show. So then I made a list of women, and I had portrayed Susan B. Anthony in a tiny role in a big cast one time, and I had to do research, and I thought, nobody knows anything about this woman. I mean, we all know that she had a dollar or something, but I didn't know any of this. So I made a list, and you have to be physically somewhat like her, so I'm personally repulsive and tall and angular and all of that. And so I couldn't be Mrs. Stanton. She was quite portly. So I decided to be her. And so I started out, and I've been doing it for 10 years now. So now I decided it's time for something new, finally. And so I'm doing now also Margaret Burke White, in case you ever want to see that. Famous photographer from Life magazine, 1930s, 40s. She had, Margaret Burke White, she had a shortened life due to an illness. She was a contemporary of Ansel Adams and Alfred Eisenstadt and Dorothea Lange and all those people, but she died younger. So anyway, but yes, so I enjoy doing this, and that's why I did it.
And you've written this entire thing yourself. This is your...
Yeah, so it's the research that's so hard, and then figuring out how do you take this life and put it in 45 minutes. It's ridiculous, really. But, yes.
In the middle, but you talked about the red shawl, how it said no red shawl, no.
No report. Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
Well, what that meant was everywhere she went, she wore a shawl, but most of the time she wore a red shawl. And it got to be her trademark, you know, like some people wear a hat or something special. And so they just were fooling her that night. They said, we're not going to do a report on you unless you have your red shawl. So she had to send someone to get her red shawl. I don't know. Well, I do know what it looked like. It didn't really look quite like this, but this is what I have, so. Yes.
Did you make that costume?
No, I did not make it. Somebody else made it. I looked in all the photographs so that it would be very authentic. And then we went in Lowell, Massachusetts to this old George's Fabrics. And the lady who made this for me said, I think this is from the 1800s. This is called file, F-A-I-L-L-E. It's very heavy, and on the bottom is a 3-tiered something or other that somebody gave me. And then my first jacket shrank, so I had to have a new jacket made. And then another person gave me this and said that her mother-in-law possibly wore it at the White House. So, and the cameo is my grandmother's, and the chair is my grandmother's. So there's a lots, and the bloomers, yeah. I just made those, I don't know. But the bloomers. So it's fun. It takes so much effort to put all this together, you know, and each little piece of it, but it's fun. Yes?
Has anyone ever brought up, when I was a young woman working, the dress code was, if you were female, you wore a skirt.
Yes.
Yeah. And a group of us decided that we wanted to wear slacks. But we had to make a plan because all of the bosses were male, and you were expected to dress like a lady.
Yes.
And so we decided that we would all come in slacks, very tailored slacks, on a certain day, and see what happened. What are they going to do? Fight us all? And we did that, and it was in 1968. And we all went in, and not a word was spoken.
Very good.
So I don't know if anybody else.
And then did you...
Somewhere in that same vicinity, maybe a year later, I was a manager at IBM in Poughkeepsie, and before I had gotten there, my woman who became my secretary had done this. She had come in a pantsuit, and her manager said, sorry, go home.
Oh.
So she appealed to the next level, and they said, sorry, go home. Finally got to the building manager, and he said, that's okay.
Yeah.
That was it. So it was happening other places.
Yes.
In the late 70s, I was a consultant for a large concrete company. And I went to speak to the boss on the 6 girls who were managers. And I said, we haven't had a raise in 2 years. And I think all the girls need the following raise, because I was in charge of them. And I went all the way down the thing. And you know what the president of the company said to me?
What?
You have to wear pants to get a raise in this company. So, being the person I was, I got together with the girls that night and I said, you come in with your husband's suit on, white shirt, and a necktie, because tomorrow there is a big meeting with the people from the Big Dig in Boston, and we have to be in the room.
And you all
We
came
all
in?
walked in together, and the guy said to me, what do you think you're doing? I said, wearing pants, because that's what I was told I had to do. And everybody would look at me and say, what do you mean that's what you had to do? I said, he knows what I'm talking about. He says, you go home, you change, and come back. I says, I don't have time. I have a very important part in this meeting financially, and I need to give my report.
Oh, my.
That day, he wrote on a piece of paper all the way around, don't any of you come in a suit tomorrow. Well, we brought clothes with us, but we came in the suit. And he says, stop it right now, what do you want? And so I gave him the list and we got it. But it wasn't too funny for some of them.
No, that sounded
Some of
very...
them were sole support of their children, and they really bucked and said, I said, get in the back of the line. I said, well,
I mean, that is very brave. I mean,
this was
that's...
in 78, 79.
What? 1978?
Yes.
That's outrageous.
And today, I'm still a management consultant. One of the things I do in every single company I go into, I do growth management, strategic planning. And I tell the guy who owns a company, who's the most important person in the company? And he'll say, I am. I said, no, you're not.
No.
The most important person in this company is that receptionist sitting at the desk, because she can make or break you in a minute. And I said, what are you paying her? And he'd tell me, I said, give her 1/3 more starting next week.
Wow.
And I do that in every company I go to.
Good for you.
And then I said to him one day, why don't you ever have a man as a receptionist in your company? And he said, well, women do a better job at it. I said, not necessarily. Women are cheaper at it.
Yeah.
And if you raise the pay, you get what you pay for.
Wow.
So that's my crusade.
There's one very brave woman. That is great. Yes.
I have a background and something of a history. Oh, I won't need that. I've got a voice downtown if I need to.
This is for the record, this is for the tape.
Oh, I see. Thank you. My history was in real estate as far as what I worked at daily. And a little while ago, I got curious about my own mortgages and deeds to my property. And I went back to the first house that my late husband and I bought, which was about 1961. And I looked at the deed, and there were no non-whites that were allowed to live in that subdivision, that area of town or that town. And women, in order to get a mortgage for with their husbands, women had to go in and say, I do not intend to have any more children, and I will not be a further burden to my husband financially, so we can afford this house. And now this was 61, and I look back on that, I had forgotten all about it.
Where was that?
And it was in Birmingham, Michigan. You've heard of a gentleman by the name of Mr. Romney that came from Bloomfield Hills? That's about 3 miles away. Yeah, we were all there.
Oh, my gosh.
But, yeah, this was in Birmingham, Michigan at the time. I was horrified.
These are interesting stories. Yes.
Why were women under such a strict dress code? Was it because it just wasn't feminine?
Well, it's just what we've been hearing from all of these women. Men just wanted women to be a certain way. They wanted them to look all pretty. It didn't matter if being pretty really interfered with what you were doing. They just wanted them to be not necessarily intelligent, just pretty.
An asset.
You know? And finally, women in the 60s and 70s said, no, we're going to wear pants. It's a lot easier to walk around and get on the subway and get in the cabs and do our jobs if we're wearing pants. And now women still wear skirts sometimes, but you wear pants if you have to. And then women finally realized they could be taxi drivers, and they could be construction workers, and they could be airline pilots. And that's when they realized we don't have to always be wearing this pretty little dress. Yes.
I know I was a telephone operator, and we had no public to see us. We had to wear heels
Yeah.
nylons and skirts.
Yes.
We had a blizzard and I got called in. And I went in ski pants and ski boots because I walked 1.5 miles.
Yeah.
And I was told I couldn't come in that way. I
Amazing.
says, I'll go home. And they said, no, you stay.
Well, I have never heard so many stories in one place. Seriously, never. Usually the women never speak up. It's very, yeah, they don't.
Welcome to Nashua.
Oh, that's right, I'm in New Hampshire.
Sally, I want to tell you how much we all appreciate it. I think we could go on a lot longer, but you were terrific. Thank you very much. You were great. And I want to invite everyone for refreshments in the kitchen just down the hall.
That's right.
Thanks very much for coming.
I forgot it.